Step into the heart of storytelling chaos, where the background sets the stage, the rising action turns up the heat, and the climax promises fireworks hotter than a dragon's salsa party. Get ready to master the juicy middle of your short story that's so gripping, even bookmarks will struggle to put it down.
Help! Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
This is the second last lesson on imaginative texts. Self 5. For me and for you. I would high five you right now if I could. Wait. This lesson focuses on the middle sections of our short stories, the background, the rising action, and the climax. Make sure you have watched the previous 3 lessons and completed their related activities before continuing with this one. And of course, the same thing applies regarding the first lesson in this module, Intro to Module 5. Very good. Moving ever onwards, lesson objectives. First up, we will recap the structure of the middle sections of a short story. The first section in the middle part of our story is the background. Therefore, we will recap the structure of that. The second section is the rising action, so we'll recap that structure too. The third section is the climax, and we may as well recap that structure. You'll be happy to know that's all the recap stuff for this lesson. Then we'll move into, recapping example 2. Okay, I think that is all the recap stuff now. Then we will look at analyzing the background section of example 2, the rising action section, and of course, the climax section. From there, we've got a simplistic summary, and we'll call it a day and go eat some guacamole. Before the guac, though, we got to look at the structure of the middle sections of our short story once again. Starting with the background section. This is what she looks like. It represents the first section in the middle part of our short story, the inverted claw. The background's got 2 elements or ingredients, one of which is the trigger. This requires you to outline what caused the protagonist to end up in the situation outlined in the exposition. The last element of the background is the conflict element. This one requires you to highlight the obstacle the protagonist must overcome, and that obstacle is really referring to the internal or external type of conflict within your story. Bear in mind, the overarching purpose of this section is to provide some background info that explains how the characters arrived in the situation outlined in the exposition, which is the section that comes before the background. You can achieve this overarching purpose by using a shift in time or place, an embedded narrative, which is a story within a story, character recollection, and/or dialogue. That is the structure of the background section of the middle part of our story. The next section is the rising action. The rising action is using a little bit of purple, and it represents the second section of the middle part of the inverted claw. Its one element or ingredient is the setback. The setback requires you to create an event, such as an unintended outcome, a complication, or a mistake, in the plot that narrowly defeats the protagonist. Overarching purpose of this bad boy is to build tension and develop the plot towards the climax. Last section we're taking a look at in this lesson is the climax. It is the section of the middle part of the story. It's got one element, and that is the finale. The finale requires you to create an event whereby the protagonist faces a strong possibility of failure, but ultimately defeats the antagonist and achieves their mission. Overarching purpose of this section, it's to illustrate the most intense, exciting, and pivotal part of the plot. And just like that, the first recap of the lesson is done. Let's turn to the next one. The relevant question: create an imaginative text with a central voice that conveys hope or redemption. Okay, that's enough. Speedy recap of step 6 of the planning steps that we looked at 2 lessons ago. This is what it looks like in the PDF study notes, but just have a read of the following underlined elements. While we're at it, we may as well just come back to the title and exposition that we looked at in the previous lesson. This is what it looks like if it's been more than 3 days since you completed the previous lesson on the exposition. Pause the video, go and give it a read, just so you know what this story is about, and we'll get stuck into it. Okay, We know what Simon Says is about. There's only one more thing left to do, and that's just to bloody start this lesson, okay? Let's just get on with it, yeah? Here is the background section. Quite sizable. Anywho, here is the background in what I'd like to think is a more engaging format. A few days ago, Mum, Dad, and I were eating breakfast at our big dining table at our home in Vienna. I was having my Sunday morning special, 2 boiled eggs with soldiers. Before eating it, I would stack my soldiers 3 by 3 to create a mini tower, while Mum would peel the shell of the eggs. She'd always give me a big kiss on my forehead with her red lips before I started eating and say, "Now everyone will know you're my boy." I never really got what she meant, and it got a little annoying sometimes, but I loved smelling her rosy perfume as she leaned over to kiss my forehead, so it wasn't so bad. Just before I placed the last soldier on the tower, the front door slammed open and a bunch of Simons barged into our house without even knocking and dragged us out into the street. I kicked and screamed at the Simon that dragged me because I didn't know it was a game yet. The Simons took us to the train station where all the other players were rounded up. While we were waiting, Dad told me about the game and its main rule, to do what Simon says. Then, the Simons told all of us to board the train. I giggled because there were way too many of us to fit, and I thought Simon was telling a joke. But then Dad shushed me, knelt, and whispered in my ear, "Charlie, remember the main rule." The carriages on the train were so full that only the very top parts of the window were free, so I didn't get to see anything for the whole trip. The only part I remember was towards the end when a few players who were at the window and tall enough to see out started crying. Then, as some whispered travelled through the carriage, almost everyone cried. All I could make out was something about a sign and Auschwitz. I was really confused, so I tugged on Dad's left trouser pocket and asked him what was happening. He just said, "The game's going to be harder than I thought, Charlie." Shortly after that, the train stopped, everyone got off, we all got in the first big, long line, we're much better at it now, and got our numbers tattooed on our forearms. While Dad was getting his tattoo, Mum knelt to look me in the eyes, and I realised her makeup looked funny. She had watercolour black lines running from her eyes. She just looked at me for a bit, then, after a few seconds, licked her thumb and wiped off the red lips on my forehead that I had completely forgotten about from earlier today. Then Mum gave me the biggest hug I've ever gotten, and a Simon took her to the girls' area. I haven't seen Mum since then, but I swear I can still smell her rosy perfume from that hug. Alright, that is the background section. Let's start off by discussing the trigger element of the background section. In the exposition section, readers learn that Charlie's mission is to win the game by escaping from the concentration camp. Justifying the protagonist's mission involves getting the audience to be emotionally invested in it. All of that's to say the background section justifies Charlie's mission by conveying how traumatic and unjust the events before the concentration camp were, especially for a 14-year-old boy. For example, we've got these parts of the background section. Charlie's life is turned upside down when the Simons barge into his family home. Then Charlie is shoved into an overcrowded train carriage full of crying people. And to top it off, Charlie is separated from his mum. The background section also gives the reader some insights into how Charlie ended up in the concentration camp to begin with. We're told Charlie and his family were dragged out into the street. Charlie's family and the other players were taken to Auschwitz by train. And Charlie and his dad were separated from Charlie's mum once they arrived. So from all of those comments, we can conclude that the trigger is the following. Charlie is taken away from his home in Vienna and into a concentration camp. That event creates the game and makes Charlie want to win it. That's the trigger element. This is the conflict element. This background section makes it pretty clear that Charlie faces an external conflict, specifically a character versus society conflict. In the exposition, readers are told that Simon personifies society, and Simon is an SS guard, the Schutzstaffel guard, who's calling the roll. That's what we discover in the exposition, but then in the background section, readers discover that Charlie refers to every SS guard as Simon. Some examples of that from the background section: a bunch of Simons. The Simons took us to the train station. A Simon took her to the girls' area. Referring to every SS guard as Simon effectively conveys the character versus society type of conflict because 1. It implies that every SS guard is the same. 2. Every guard embodies the Schutzstaffel, which in and of itself embodies Nazism. And thirdly, Nazism was the dominant ideology of German society in the 1930s and 1940s. Recall that in the exposition, readers can infer that Charlie is in a concentration camp, but the precise details of it are unknown. Auschwitz is the most notorious concentration camp of the Nazi regime. It is associated with some of the most horrific acts in history. Telling the reader that Charlie is at Auschwitz does two things. First, it highlights the obstacle Charlie must overcome to accomplish his mission. And 2, it emphasizes the gravity or the seriousness of the situation outlined in the exposition. Those are some comments directed at our 2 elements of the background section. Here are some miscellaneous comments that didn't really fit neatly into one of those ingredients. These highlighted parts on the slide foreshadow something that is discussed in the final section of this story, the resolution that we're looking at in the next lesson. So watch out for references to this stuff about the boiled eggs and the tin soldiers and the perfume in that section. The following extracts highlighted on the slide depict the big kiss on my forehead as a symbol of individuality and autonomy. Charlie's mum then wipes off the red lips before entering the concentration camp, which itself forbid autonomy and individuality. Ultimately, these extracts suggest that Charlie's mum has succumbed to the reality of a concentration camp. The background section also uses some auditory imagery. All I could make out was something about a sign and Auschwitz. The relevant device being used here is onomatopoeia. Don't ask me how to spell that word. And it's being used in this excerpt to tell the reader that Charlie's being sent to Auschwitz concentration camp. That's the background section. Here is the rising action section. This is what the full version of the rising action looks like. This is the deconstructed version. 372, Simon says. Yes, sir, a faint voice says. It started raining pretty heavily about 5 minutes ago. I hate this part of the game because we're not allowed to go undercover and we just have to stand still. The thing that makes it okay is that all the players move closer to each other in the single file line, and the body heat makes me feel a bit warmer. My feet start to muddy and blacken as the rain picks up and patters against the grey dirt. It's so loud that I can barely hear Simon's voice down the line. This is when Dad starts whispering to me again as I continue facing the front of the line. Can you feel your shoes sinking a little bit, Charlie? I nod and squirm as I feel mud touch my unsocked left foot. The more rain there is, the softer the dirt gets. The softer the dirt gets, the easier it is to dig. Are you following, Charlie? I nod again and figure out what Dad's getting at. The next time we're in our huts at night and the rain's so loud that we can't sleep, that's when we'll make our move. But when the time comes, we need to make sure the rain's really loud, because that'll mean it'll be hard to spot us once we're outside the hut. Charlie, when that time comes, it's going to be like the finale of the game, and thud, splat. I turn around and see Dad, still as a plank of wood, lying on his right-hand side in the mud, almost engulfed by it, and Simon to his right, holding a rifle by the muzzle. Dad! I scream so loud it hurts. As the rain pours on the left-hand side of Dad's face, it clears the specks of mud and a large red oval-like shape on his temple appears. It's the same shape as the butt of Simon's rifle. 2 Simons drag Dad's body away while another picks me up and demands that I stop screaming. I don't do as Simon says. That's the rising action. Let's discuss a few things about it. The rising action has got the one element, the one ingredient. It's the setback. The setback is Charlie's dad dying, but Charlie not fully being aware of this yet. While this setback doesn't narrowly defeat the protagonist, it achieves the specific purpose of conveying to the reader that the protagonist, Charlie, is a real person who experiences complications. This type of setback could be framed as an action has an unintended outcome or a complication arises. The unintended outcome is Charlie's dad just did not expect to get a fatal blow to the head by talking to Charlie. And the complication is that Charlie and his dad were meant to win the game together. Recall from the exposition that the protagonist's mission is to escape from the concentration camp. However, the specifics of how exactly he will accomplish that aren't told to us. The only thing we're told is that it somehow involves a fence. The emboldened parts on the slide tell us those specifics of how Charlie can achieve his mission. Basically, they're going to make their move when it's raining really loudly. That rain will provide some sort of noise blanket that will allow them to slip away past any guards, make it to the fence, and then use all of the water that has seeped into the soil to dig under the soil, under the fence, and make a run for it. These excerpts also represent the lesson Charlie learns as a result of the setback that proves useful in the climax. In this part of the story, Charlie's dad wouldn't have died if he didn't share the escape plan with Charlie, but then Charlie wouldn't have the information he needed to escape. It's a double-edged sword. That's the setback element. Here are some miscellaneous comments. This sentence packs a bit of a punch, and it achieves that effect in 3 ways. One way is its short, brief syntax. It's a short sentence. Another way is through its symbolism. Charlie complied with the main rule by doing what Simon said until Simon hurt his dad. After that, Charlie's anger and sadness made him disobey Simon, which symbolizes his growth as a character. Thirdly, this sentence packs a punch because it references the title. Some other things to note here. The audience is told in the exposition section that about 400 players are lined up in single file and that Simon is conducting a roll call to ensure each player is present. Therefore, this opening line of the rising action tells attentive readers that the roll call is almost finished, which foreshadows what happens at the end of this section and makes what happened more believable. In other words, it foreshadows that Simon will shortly start walking back up the line and then hear Charlie's dad whispering to Charlie. Up next, we've got a few examples of sensory imagery. The thing that makes it okay is that all the players move closer to each other in the single file line and the body heat makes me feel a bit warmer. This is an example of tactile imagery. You can't help but imagine what that body heat would feel like if you were in this situation. My feet start to muddy and blacken as the rain picks up and patters against the grey dirt. This emboldened part uses tactile imagery and auditory imagery. You can feel the mud on your feet and you can hear the rain pattering on the mud. It's so loud that I can barely hear Simon's voice down the line. Once again, an example of auditory imagery. I nod and squirm as I feel mud touch my unsocked left foot. Tactile imagery. As the rain pours on the left-hand side of Dad's face, it clears the specks of mud and a large red oval-like shape on his temple appears. It's the same shape as the butt of Simon's rifle. These 2 sentences encourage the reader to visually imagine what that red oval shape would look like on Charlie's dad's head. Finally, thud splat is an example of onomatopoeia. O-N-O-M-A-T-O-P-O, O-N-O-M-A-T-O-P-O, O-N-O-M-A-T-O-P-O-E-I-A, O-N-O-M-A-T-O-P-O-E-I-A, P-O-E-I-A, P-O-E-O-I, O-N-O-M-A-T-O-P-O-E-I-A. No, I give up. That is the rising action section. One more to go, it's the climax. The complete version of the climax and the deconstructed version. It's been days since I saw Dad dragged away by the Simons. I feel lonely without him or Mum around, but that only makes me want to win the game even more. Each night I lie next to other players on the floor of one of the huts, unable to sleep, waiting for the really loud rain to come. I usually spend this time thinking about every move I'll take to win or asking other players next to me whether they've seen my dad. The mini games we play every day are so tiring that most people fall asleep the moment their heads hit the wooden floor, so I never really get an answer. But I keep asking each night anyway. The thought of another player saying something positive about Dad is really nice and helps me get through the mini games. Tonight, I'm lying next to 83 on my left and 129 on my right. I turn my head to 83 and ask him my usual question. Have you seen my dad? He's number 49 and a few Simons dragged him away a few days ago. No answer. I turn to 129. Have you seen my... Out of nowhere, the drizzle of rain outside becomes a downpour. It's like God took every cloud on the planet and moved them so they're right above our hut. Dad? 129's eyes open. Huh? The rain gets loud. Have you seen my dad? I scream, trying to speak over the rain that's now woken up just about every player in the hut. Huh? 129 asks again. How have you... And then I remember. This is how I win the game. Ooh, suspense. What is going to happen? We have to discuss this section before we find out. Its one ingredient is the finale. The crux of the finale in this story is Charlie's escape. The following sentences imply Charlie's escape. The first sentence suggests Charlie knows exactly what he will do when the moment's right. The second sentence implies Charlie has recognized the right moment is now. And because of that, he seizes the moment and escapes, successfully completing his mission. Also note how the details of the escape aren't disclosed in this part of the story. We'll see how Charlie escapes in the resolution, the final section, though how Charlie escapes is not as important as how he develops as a person. But more about that stuff in the resolution. How's that for some foreshadowing? The overarching similarity between the setback ingredient in the rising action and the finale ingredient in the climax is Charlie's mission to escape the concentration camp. Maintaining a common thread like this throughout the story makes it more compelling to the reader. Put differently, too many plot points detract from the protagonist's mission and confuse the reader. Imagine if this was actually the ending of the climax section of the story. Have you seen my... Before I finish asking my question, the hut's door flings open. In the doorway, there's a man with drowsy eyes held up by his armpits by two Simons behind him. His head stooped down, and his arms and legs are limp like a rag doll. The Simons drop the man at the floor and slam it behind them as they leave. The man wriggles a bit and turns his head, and our eyes lock. Dad? While that is a happy ending of sorts, it has nothing to do with Charlie's mission. Remember, the antagonist is Simon, who embodies Nazism. So really, Charlie was under the control of Nazism while he was in the concentration camp. Therefore, Charlie's escape from the camp symbolizes his liberation from Nazism. A few other things to note. Charlie accomplishes his mission using his dad's escape plan, which was illustrated in the rising action. The emboldened parts on the slide tell us those specifics of how Charlie can achieve his mission. Charlie's use of that escape plan connects the events from the rising action to the events in the climax. What I'm really saying here is that each plot point serves the overarching purpose of advancing the story. Put differently, the climax relies on the events of the rising action relies on the events in the background, and so on. The plot is airtight. That only makes me want to win the game even more. This is a really easy way of telling the reader that the protagonist still wants to achieve his mission despite losing contact with firstly his mum and now his dad. It reminds the reader that we have something clear to root for, and it implies what the finale's main purpose or objective is: to create an event that gives Charlie an opportunity to escape. The finale doesn't explicitly convey that Charlie faces a strong possibility of failure, such as, "The guards are gaining on me as I approach the fence." However, the shock and brutality of the setback tell the reader that something horrible can happen any moment. The depiction of the minigames highlight how dire the situation is. They're so tiring that people fall asleep the moment their heads hit the wooden floor, despite how uncomfortable that would be. And Charlie's several unsuccessful attempts to speak over the really loud rain convey a sense of hopelessness and heighten the suspense. Those were a few points specifically regarding the finale element. Here are some miscellaneous comments. These emboldened excerpts develop Charlie's character by highlighting his determination. That only makes me want to win the game even more. Waiting for the really loud rain to come, I usually spend this time thinking about every move I'll take to win. We get a sense that this kid is pretty determined to try and win this game. Moving to a different comment, it's like God took every cloud on the planet and moved them so they're right above our hut. This simile conveys the intensity of the downpour, indicate that Charlie's moment to execute his dad's plan has come, and tells the reader that Charlie is probably religious through the reference to God. Couple more things. The capitalized dialogue, "Have you seen my dad?" is a form of auditory imagery that suggests the rain is so loud that Charlie literally has to scream to speak over it. Remember, a dash is used to cut off dialogue, and here Charlie is cutting off his own dialogue because he suddenly remembers this is his time to strike. Lovely. That is a wrap on the middle sections of the short story. Let's pack her up with the simplest of summaries. First part of the lesson, we recapped the structure of the middle sections of our short story. starting with the structure of the background section, the overarching purpose of which is to provide some background info that contextualizes the exposition. It's got two elements or ingredients. One of them is the trigger. This is where you should indicate what caused the protagonist to end up in the situation outlined in the exposition. The other ingredient is the conflict. This requires you to highlight the obstacle the protagonist must overcome. In other words, an external or internal conflict to accomplish their mission. That is the structure of the background section. Then we looked at the structure of the rising action. Overarching purpose, you build tension and develop the plot towards the climax. One ingredient, it's the setback, and this is where you create an event, in other words, an unintended outcome, a complication, or a mistake, in the plot that narrowly defeats the protagonist. Then we recap the structure of the climax section. Overarching purpose is to illustrate the most pivotal aspect of the entire story. It's got one element, it is the finale, and the finale requires you to create an event whereby the protagonist faces a strong possibility of failure and ultimately defeats the antagonist and achieves their mission. After we did that recap of those sections of our short story, we then had a look at example 2. Here are some key takeaways regarding our discussion of this section, specifically regarding the trigger. Justifying the protagonist's mission involves getting the audience emotionally invested in it. One way you can get the audience emotionally invested is by depicting an outrageous event. For example, the protagonist's puppy is killed by a hitman. That's outrageous. The other element of the background section is the conflict element. If you're constructing a character versus society conflict, consider subverting conventions of characterization by including numerous nondescript antagonists who share the same name and represent an ideology. That's a mouthful. Basically, all of that is done in Simon Says because Simon represents Nazism. Another thing about the conflict element, utilize connotative language to heighten the severity of the conflict. For example, Auschwitz connotes or makes you think of the word Auschwitz. We then discussed a few miscellaneous comments regarding this section. One of those, foreshadowing significant events in the resolution by referring to them in the background, effectively creates a cohesive story and circular structure. Example, I swear I can still smell her rosy perfume from that hug. Bear that in mind when we take a look at the last section of this story in the next lesson. A final point regarding this section, utilize symbols to add emotional depth to the story. Example, red lipstick mark on Charlie's forehead is a symbol of autonomy and individuality. Very good. Those are some points regarding the background section. These are some points regarding the rising action. Specifically, it's got the one element, which is the setback. In the setback, disclose these specific details of how the protagonist will accomplish their mission. These details might represent the lesson the protagonist learns after being defeated by the antagonist. A few miscellaneous comments. Consider referring to your short story's title for dramatic effect. Example, I don't do as Simon says. Final point. Construct believable circumstances for the setback to take place in. Example, the loud rain makes it plausible, believable for a Simon to creep up on Charlie's dad. Cool. One last section, it's got the one element, which is the finale. One point regarding the finale, consider ending it on a cliffhanger and explaining the specific details of what happened in the resolution section. Example, this is how I win the game. Also, maintain a common thread throughout your story. For example, reiterating the protagonist's mission. Remember that too many plot points detract from the protagonist's mission and also confuses the reader. Another point is bear in mind the protagonist can symbolically defeat the antagonist. Example, Charlie's escape from the concentration camp symbolizes his liberation from Nazism. Finally, ensure that each plot point serves the purpose of advancing the overarching story. We've got one miscellaneous comment. Utilize capitalized dialogue to convey a character's intensity or loudness of speech. Yeah, buddy. That's a wrap for this lesson, which means you've just got one more left on imaginative texts. So close. That final lesson is all about the resolution part of our short story. Before watching that one though, make sure you complete this lesson's activities. What could they ask you to do? I'll leave it up to your imagination. But remember what I said in the previous lesson, try and actually have some fun with it. Don't think of it as an assessment, think of it as creating a story. That's all it is, it's just a story. If you can really embrace that, it'll make this whole task 10 times easier and you'll end up getting a better mark. One final thing, and then I will shut up. From the first page of the PDF activities for this lesson, you'll find a page titled Bonus Content, the middle sections of example 1. If you want to see another example of these sections being used in action, feel free to go and check out those sections of that story. If you've got a good idea of what to do in these middle sections just by watching this lesson, don't worry about reading it, all good, and just head straight to the actual activities which come after those sections. Wonderful. Mouth zipped. I'll see you in the next lesson. Until then, keep it simple.